Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of the Wellbeing Show. I've got a great guest, Michael, who's joining us from the US, and who it's been quite a journey just to get him sat here because the first time we met, I got a call, an emergency call from a client, and I had to stop it and go and deal with that. And then subsequently, we've just been going backwards and forwards. It's been ridiculous. Never had this experience before, but Michael stayed with us, which is brilliant, and I'm glad that you have. We're going to be talking about issues around men, empowering men into what Michael describes as the new male paradigm. So we're going to learn about that and about himself in a moment. Just to remind you, although it might seem like it's live, it's not. So don't call me on this number I'm going to give you while you're watching the show because I might be doing something else. I probably will be. I might even be in bed. I'm that old. So, but the number, if you want to WhatsApp me and send messages. That's is 07506 319 745. Do drop me a message if you want to get further information. We'll also put contact details for Michael, like his website and stuff. Um, but do send us messages and comments. You can always comment underneath the video anyway if you're watching it on YouTube. That's enough from me. Michael, welcome. How you doing?
Well, it is my absolute joy and privilege to be with you today. This is a topic that I'm extremely passionate about because my personal belief is that the greatest challenge we have on the planet is to redefine manhood and masculinity. And I
Yeah.
think having these types of conversations can do just that.
Yeah, because masculinity is getting a bad rap, not unsurprisingly. There are a lot of things that are happening around toxic masculinity. I presume that's a term that you're familiar with in the US. Um, and sort of some of the stats and figures around men killing themselves, men being violent to other men, male violence towards women, numbers in prison, 98% of our prisoners in the UK are men. I presume it's similar story in the US, pretty similar stories. 75% of suicides, men, etc., etc. So there's some disastrous figures there that we need to sort of look at and unpick a bit.
Yeah, and if I could, I just want to throw something in about this toxic masculinity that we hear a lot of.
Yeah.
I don't believe there's such a thing. And
Okay.
here's why. Because I believe people confuse a toxic behavior with toxic masculinity.
Hey.
So we see domestic violence or something like that. We go, oh, look, there's toxic masculinity. No, that's not toxic masculinity. That's a toxic behavior that is the result of a man being disconnected from his authentic masculinity. Because when a man is connected to his authentic masculinity, he would never exhibit a toxic behavior.
Yeah.
So doing this work, I believe, will help hopefully remove that phrase from society because in and of itself, masculinity is not toxic. That's just my 2 cents worth.
No, no, it's really important. So it's about reclaiming that word. So it's not sort of taken possession of by certain behaviors which we all reject.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, I get it. So thank you for that. That's a really good reframing. Let's go back a little bit on you. You're in the US at the moment. You sound like you were born and brought up in the US. Were you born and brought up in where you are now? You're in
I was
Houston?
actually I was actually born in Corpus Christi, Texas, which is a little city on the coast,
Yeah.
South Texas, currently called Houston home.
Ah, Houston home. You call you as Houston home, sorry.
Yeah, yeah.
So Corpus Christi, is it close to Houston or is it?
It's about a 3.5 hour drive south of Houston.
Okay. Corpus Christi is a place in the UK as well, oddly
Really?
enough. It's the name of one of the universities in Cambridge.
Uh,
So you have the Ivy League, and we have Oxford and Cambridge. We call it Oxbridge, and Corpus Christi is an area there. So
Interesting.
you, it's in the South, Texas. Is that right?
Yes. Yes. That's
And
almost on the Mexico border, but just further south, right on the coast. Beautiful city, kind of boring. That's one of the
yeah.
reasons I left. It's a great tourist city, great place to visit, but definitely wouldn't want to live there.
Okay, so we don't know much about the southern state of Texas in the UK, apart from you've got a very sort of internationally known governor, good or ill. He seems to be on television all the time. I'm not here to be politically one way or the other, but he does get featured a lot, and he seems to have sort of views that people have strong feelings about. Also, there is a history of sort of racism, etc., in the South, in particularly in America. And so, what was it like for you growing up, sort of as a young man of color?
Well, yeah, let's go back a little bit. So I was born in the inner city projects of Corpus Christi, Texas, to a single mom with 6 kids, and we were basically the poster children for poverty back in the 60s. But despite that, my mom, bless her heart, she really instilled in me a simple idea. And I'll never forget the conversation she and I had when I was approximately 8 years old. And she said this, Michael, if you want something badly enough, there is no one or no thing that can keep you from attaining it except yourself.
Okay.
Now, remember, this is back in the 60s.
Yeah.
Okay. And so it was that lesson, though, that challenged me as a man who happens to be Black to not identify with all the negative stereotypes about Black men. I just made up my mind at a very early age that if I wanted something badly enough, no one could stop me from attaining it except myself.
Mhm.
And so, yes, I remember, matter of fact, I remember racial riots in elementary school. In elementary school, we had racial riots with police coming in to the schools in elementary school. And growing up through high school, dealt with a lot of racism, a lot of challenges with that. But I feel blessed that I never bought into the whole idea that being Black was somehow a disadvantage.
Mhm.
My mom instilled in me that idea that if I wanted it badly enough, so it for me it never slowed me down. I just had this belief that I was capable of accomplishing whatever I set my mind to. And so it was an amazing time of my life. And I will say this, Noel, I like to think of myself as an irrepressible optimist with a passion for the impossible. That's my tagline. And I say that because despite all of the obstacles, specifically about race, I didn't allow it to stop me from doing what I wanted to do.
So,
I started my first company when I was 14 years old, uh, climbed the corporate ladder at a very early age. But hey, well, let me share this story. When I was in the 11th grade, I went to this seminar, and this guy convinced me that I could get rich selling vacuum cleaners.
um,
So I dropped out of high school in the 11th grade
mhm.
to pursue my dream of becoming rich.
Mhm.
Now, it was a really poor choice because number one, I never sold a single vacuum cleaner. So there I was, a young Black male in America with only an 11th grade education. Chances of success slim to none.
Mhm.
Fortunately, I landed this job with this building supply center. I worked extremely hard. I climbed the corporate ladder pretty quickly and actually became the youngest manager in the history of this particular company at the age of 22.
Right.
And by the age of 23, I was living the American dream. I had the house, the wife, 2.5 kids, and all of that. And by society standards, I was pretty successful.
Mhm.
But by the age of 29, my American dream turned into the American nightmare
Mhm.
as I went through a divorce, bankruptcy, foreclosure, a deep, deep state of depression. I was actually homeless for 2 years living out of my car.
Mhm.
And during that dark period of my life, I asked myself a simple question.
Mhm.
What does it mean to be a man? Because I had done everything I thought a man was supposed to do to be happy,
Yeah.
and I was absolutely miserable. And so I decided I was going to figure it all out, figured it all out. So I began what I'll call my journey of transformation.
Mhm.
And that journey led me, first of all, I gained the courage to go to therapy, which opened a lot of doors for me. And
Mhm.
I became obsessed with personal growth and development, doing workshops and seminars and listening to audio programs. And slowly I was able to rebuild my life. And in doing so, I said, I want to share the lessons I learned with
Okay.
other men.
Can I ask you a question about that? Because I'm really genuinely interested in why people in the face of this extreme adversity, which is where you were, you'd had it all, it was taken away. There were, if you like, two options. You could have continued into the adversity and decided to get angry and become a victim, etc. But you chose not to. What do you think in you made you think, oh, no, I'm not going to go that route. I'm going to go this route and take I guess, some sense of responsibility for it. I'm going to take responsibility for myself because that's quite a serious rock bottom. Do you know what I mean? It's like you've done everything right, and yet still life dumps on you. It would have been understandable to go, this is really shit. I don't want this, but you didn't. So, what was it in you? Where did you get that from? Do you think?
Well, I think it began, first of all, with the lessons I learned from my mom.
Okay.
My mom exemplified resilience. Again, we were inner city projects,
Yeah.
poor. My mom worked 2 or 3 jobs at a time. And yet, I never once remember hearing my mom say anything negative about our situation. I never heard her say, white people are keeping me back, or, she didn't have, my mom just worked. She had an amazing work ethic and she dealt with lots of adversity. And I just never saw her get down or play victim. And
Right.
I think that really contributed a lot to it. On a deeper level, I recognize and believe that every human being has a divine purpose.
Mhm.
And I believe we all have unique gifts and talents, and it's our responsibility to figure out what they are.
Mhm.
And sometimes the universe has to take drastic measures to get our attention to help us fulfill our divine purpose.
Mhm.
And so for me at the time, I was actually an atheist. I didn't believe in anything greater than myself, outside of myself. And I think that was part of the reasons why I was able to deal with the challenges, because my mindset was always, how can I fix it? I never said, God, why are you doing this to me? Or, why is society? I just said, okay, so we got to fix this. And that's been my mindset. And again, I think that resiliency comes from my mom.
Mhm.
And so it was that gift that my mom gave me to deal with adversity that I think allowed me to not go. And another thing is I didn't drink alcohol. I think if I would have drank alcohol, I
Oh,
probably, yeah,
smart.
probably would have been dead. So
Yeah, yeah,
not
yeah.
drinking alcohol really helped. But again, I think it boils down to, number one, the resiliency that I learned from my mom, and secondly, a divine purpose that was ingrained in me at a very early age.
It's really interesting. This idea of having a bigger meaning and purpose during times of trouble. And I talked a lot about it with people during the pandemic, when we all had this sort of existential experience. It sounds like you had an existential experience, and your existence and your meaning was in question. And I counsel people to find a purpose bigger than themselves, not necessarily religious or spiritual, doesn't really matter. Serving others is bigger than me. Being kind to people, that's bigger than me. Finding purpose and meaning beyond that. Was that something your mum did as well? Was that your childhood was about? Was she very much connected to other people, helping people less fortunate, that sort of stuff?
Never had any of that. My mom was a very religious person.
Okay.
Um, made us go to church, and even though I hated going to church, she was very religious, and she had a deep sense of helping others. But again, the situation that we were in didn't allow her to do that monetarily, if you will.
Yeah.
But she was just a loving, caring person. She was just a loving, caring person that I noticed that, she just gave off this energy of attracting people because of who she was.
Right.
She just, the friends that she had,
I
just
think you're connected to that community. Was she well known, and she was involved in the church and involved in sort of various groups and organizations, etc.?
church primarily.
Right. And so
Mhm.
that was a good modeling, I guess, of that sense in which, even in adversity, if you're connecting with other people, that halves the problems in many ways. That really, really helps. And I presume she sort of did you. I know that you didn't like going to church. I remember I'm a lapsed Catholic, so I used to go every Sunday. It's the only day when we wore really smart clothes. We were all well behaved and turned up and we go to church. I quite enjoyed going to church, I have to say, because Catholicism is quite good fun, or it was. Now it's a bit boring, but it used to be lots of pomp and circumstance and sung mass and smells and bells, we used to call it. So I quite enjoyed it as a kid because it was quite entertaining. Um,
Well, if
but
if I can dovetail though,
yeah,
here's where my life changed. Um, we were like say what I had six siblings, and my mom was a single parent. And one of my
I
sisters, my
just don't
oldest,
know why people do it. It's like just
my
how did that generation survive? It's unreal, isn't it?
but my oldest sister got really sick, and so my mom had to take me, one of my brothers, and one of my sisters to live with our father. Okay. And my father happened to live with his mother, which was my grandmother, and she was the grandmother from hell, literally.
Wow.
And she was a raging alcoholic, and she abused me in all sorts of ways. And at an early age, I began questioning God because here was the person that was responsible for taking care of me who was abusing me in all sorts of ways. And she had the Jesus statue on the wall. She had the pictures of
Yeah.
Jesus. She
Okay.
made me go to church, but she never went to church. And she claimed to love Jesus, right? Well, even as a kid, it it gave me a lot of skepticism because this Jesus person that she kept talking about was not reflected in how she treated me.
Yeah.
And so there was a disconnect. And so at a very early age, I was really skeptical about God because of how abusive this person was.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget when I was probably 13, she forced me to get baptized. I was brought up Baptist. She forced me to get baptized. And I remember I was terrified because in my little mind, I was the sinner. And I was thinking, what if this guy drowns me because I'm such a bad person?
Quite. Yes, quite.
And so I go in and I remember stepping into the pool and I remember the guy grabbing me and then he dunks me in the water. He pulls me up. And I remember this sense of relief that I was still alive because I'm like, at least I made it through that. But I never connected, this whole Baptist thing about being bathed by the Holy Spirit. That just didn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
But because of the way my grandmother treated me, I think that was the primary reason I didn't believe in God at a very early age.
Okay. Okay. It's interesting because I think that that idea, that contrast between what somebody's saying and what they're doing is very confusing when you're a child. Uh,
Absolutely.
so they say one thing and they do another thing. And it's often the case if a parent says, I love you, yet they behave in ways that seem hateful, then we get very distorted views of what those things mean. Um,
Right.
it can be. But your mum seemed to walk the walk and talk the talk, as it were. She was very congruent, we might say, in a sort of psychotherapy terms. Sort of what she felt, what she meant, who she was, the whole package worked together and was consistent. Is that right?
Yeah. So I spent what I'll call my 7 years of hell with my
Right.
grandmother.
Okay.
And then I was reunited with my mom. And again, through junior high school and high school, I was with my mom. And
Okay.
again, she instilled in me this amazing work ethic and this sense of responsibility. She's like, Michael, you're responsible for your life.
Yeah.
You can't blame anybody else. So you've got to go out there and make it happen.
But
And
it
so
doesn't sound like she gave you shame about that, though, because sometimes making people feel responsible. I get responsibility is really important. We have to find what am I responsible for and deal with it. And obviously, there are certain things we're not responsible for. You weren't responsible for your grandmother and her behavior. You couldn't possibly be held account for that. But later on in life, you can be held account for how you relate to her behavior, right? So that's the difference. But your mum never gave you a sense of shame about any of that
not
responsibility.
not at all. My sense and my feeling that I got from my mom was that she was empowering me to know what I was capable of.
Okay, right. Your potential.
Yes. So when she said be responsible, she said, look, nobody's going to do it for you.
Yeah.
So what do you want to accomplish? Go out there, make it happen. So that's the sense that I got. No shame in it at all.
And that keyword empowerment, I think, which is really
Yes.
important. Can you tell me about empowerment? I want to come back a little bit on this story because there's a notable lack of male figureheads there in your early childhood. We'll come back to that. And it's, I think, a significant part of who you are and why you're doing what you are now. But just tell me about empowerment and what that means and the difference between that and other forms of knowledge or authority.
Well, for me, coming from my mom, when I think about empowerment, I think about her being able to see and sense in me
Yeah.
what I was capable of.
Okay.
She always told me, Michael, here's the key to your success, which was your brain.
Okay.
She says, you're very smart, which I was. I was very studious, even though I dropped out of high school in high school. But as I was growing up, I mean, I could fix things. I loved reading. And so that empowerment was, Michael, you're freaking amazing. You can do whatever, whatever you want to do in life. So that was kind of the message that I got that yes, I was capable of doing anything I set my mind to.
So it's that sense in which it's not what knocks you down, but it's how you get up again.
Yes.
And they
And again,
need to get up again.
she she did that mostly through her actions because
Yeah.
I remember, I remember I wanted to go to my junior high prom, right? And I needed $200 for my tux and all of that. And my mom went out and got an extra job just to raise the money
Yeah.
for that 200. I'll never forget that. And I'll never forget walking in, buying the tux and putting on the tux and seeing the pride in her eyes. But for me, what I saw was this woman who was willing to do anything for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I love my mom for that. And again, she instilled that sense of motherhood, if you will, of loving your children in a way that fortunately I was able to carry on to my own kids.
Yeah. So you internalized that very much so, and you took that rather than the twisted message from your grandmother, which is great.
Exactly.
Let's go back a little bit. I mean, there are these two powerful female figures in your life, one abusive and one very loving, and you went with the loving person, which is good for you because your life has definitely turned out better because you went in that direction. We can clearly see. But there was a lack of sort of male authority figures there that are loving or otherwise. Do you mind talking about that, what that's like now looking back on it?
Yeah, it's interesting because when I was 13 and we lived in these government housing,
Yeah.
and my three closest friends, the one thing we all had in common was we came from single parent households.
Okay. Okay.
And so we created this clique, this loving, supportive, belonging group, right? That we had each other, even though we didn't have men in our lives, we had each other. And it's interesting because I read somewhere that most people that go through really traumatic, abusive situations end up doing the same thing. But then there's a small group that do the complete opposite. And that was me. I did the complete opposite. For example, I made a commitment when I was probably 12 that I was going to be a great dad. And here's why. I remember exactly what happened.
Oh,
As mentioned, I moved in with my dad who lives with his mom, my crazy grandmother. And I remember one time my dad, who I did not have a good relationship with, I remember my dad spanking me for something.
mm,
And we had this house that was up on cinder blocks, and I could literally crawl under the house. And there were these concrete steps that I would go and I would play with my toys underneath these concrete steps. Well, after I got this spanking, I'm under the steps and I'm crying because my dad had spanked me. And I remember this exact thought. When I grow up and have kids, I'm not going to treat my kids the way my dad treats me.
mhm.
I remember that thought as though it were yesterday. I'm crying and this feeling that, you know what, I'm going to be a great dad.
Yeah.
And so, fortunately for me, when I had kids, because I didn't have a great relationship with my dad, I knew that I needed to learn how.
Yeah.
So what did I do? I started reading books. I started going to workshops and seminars after my divorce because I didn't want my kids to be traumatized. I want to minimize that, right? So I learned how to be a great dad, even though I didn't have a great dad in my own life.
Which is
And
which is really interesting because I think being a parent is not something anybody gets taught to do. We just simply replicate what was given to us. I mean, that's a fact. And if what was given to us wasn't very good, we're going to replicate that unless we have what you had, it seems to me, which is some humility to understand that you didn't know what you were doing with this stuff. Because everybody will tell you, I don't know how to be a parent, and that's fair enough. But as long as your own child was good enough, generally you're going to be a good enough parent. But if you've
yeah,
recognized that your own fathering wasn't how, I mean, I guess you had these experiences, but often, and I'm intrigued by this genuinely, often, as you say, there is an intergenerational repetition of things because people don't realize what happened to them was wrong. But somehow you realize what happened to you was wrong and you didn't want to do it. Why do you think that was? Why are you part of that small group from your own reflection?
again, I have to point to divine purpose.
Okay.
I really see my life as a gift. And the fact that I was able to overcome all of these adversities that I've gone through, and I'm now able to help other men uh, deal with the challenges that we as men face. I have to point to divine providence. That's the only way I can explain it because I don't know how. I just intuitively knew that I could be a great father. I could be a great husband. I just knew that.
Yeah.
My saving grace has been that I love reading.
Okay.
I love books. And so
Yeah.
I always would go to a book when I couldn't understand something.
Yeah.
So divorce, when I went through my divorce, I read books on dealing with divorce. I read books on fatherhood. Again, I went on this amazing transformational journey. But here's what I believe. Being a great father isn't genetic. Being a great father is learned behavior.
Thank God.
Yeah. Therefore, any
Because we've
man,
been really messed up as a race. Do you know what I mean? As
any
it would be over. Good for you.
yeah, any man can become a great father,
I agree. I agree.
regardless of what type of relationship he had with his father. And so again, I just feel pretty blessed and humbled that I was able to, despite the fact not having a relationship with my dad, become a great father because of a commitment I made when I was just a kid.
But I think there is a step just before it, which again, I'm going to press you a little bit if you don't mind. Um, because there's a step before it, which is the ability to view one's own experience and have a critical relationship to it. Now, very often when people go through traumatic experiences, they relive it. They can't have a critical perspective. They can't have an observer position, which is what we call in, say, something like mindfulness, where you can look at yourself internally and make a critical awareness. But you maintained a critical awareness or you developed a critical awareness to yourself and knew that there was a deficit. Do you know what that was about? I'm wondering the role of these other young men that you form this little clique with. And are you still in touch with them? I'm quite intrigued by them as part of your story.
Oh yeah, all three of them I am
Right.
still in contact with some
Tell
40
me,
years.
tell me about them. I'm really interested. It's an interesting sort of little thing that you did as boys.
Well, what's interesting though is of the four, okay, I was quote unquote the most successful one, right? So when I became this manager of this building supply center, I was one of my friends I invited to come to work, give him a job because he didn't have a job. So he came and worked with me. Two of them chose not to come.
Yeah.
So in support of my friends, obviously I wanted to kind of help them get on top, if you will. But I helped one of them out. But the other two kind of felt, uh, in a lot of ways, I felt alone because of my success.
Yes. Yes,
I
yeah,
wanted I wanted to help them, but yet, I was the first one in the group to buy a house, to get married, and to do
yeah,
all these things. And so I was constantly saying, come visit because we were in different cities, but we were still in contact. So there was a little sadness for a long time when I succeeded that my friends hadn't succeeded with me.
yeah.
And so again, wanting to help them, I did again, one of them did come up and work with me for a while, but the whole support system at the time was unique in that although my friends and I were really close, there was a part of me that they didn't even see.
Hmm.
So, for example, when I lived with my grandmother, I was a straight A student. Okay. Straight A student. I spent most of my time alone. When I got back with my mom and I was in junior high school and I had these friends, I literally dumbed down because my friends weren't good in school. So
Right.
we would skip school and do things, if you will. But it was more important to me to have this friendship than to do good in school. And so that I think that's a trap that a lot of us, especially as young Black men, fall into.
Yeah.
Just having that sense of belonging and being willing to or not willing to academically be successful because to our friends that's not cool.
Yeah.
You
But and
know,
that's the problem with young men, full stop.
yeah,
Men across the globe are failing in school. In Western cultures, are failing in school because school is failing boys. I think. I would genuinely say it that way around. I don't think boys are failing. I think the school system is failing boys,
right.
and that's a both our countries. I think are very similar in that. And then you have the other intersectional issues about race, class, etc. that come into that. But gender is a big determinant in that as one as well.
Yeah. And again, so in full circle, basically the way I see it is my divine purpose.
Yeah.
The reason I was put on this planet was to empower and inspire others.
Okay. Okay.
And so as I look at all the obstacles that I've overcome, all of the challenges, and yet still maintained. And actually, here's the way I see it. Every adversity that we experience in our lives actually brings us a gift and a lesson if we're
Yeah.
willing to look deeply enough. Okay. So for me, as I think about those 7 years of hell that I was talking about,
Yeah.
from 6 to 13, as painful and as difficult as they were, I can now see how they were absolutely perfect for my divine purpose.
Okay.
Because during that time, I became very independent. I became very self-aware. Okay. And so at a very early age, without even knowing it, became self-aware of how important my thinking was, how
Okay.
important how important it was for me to learn stuff. And so at an early age,
Yeah.
because of the situation I was in, it challenged me to be a straight A student because my mom said that that was the only way I could get back to her. She said, "Look, if when she dropped me off, which created all sorts of abandonment issues that I don't even want to go into,
Yeah.
but that whole situation challenged me as a human being to become better,
Mm.
and it really laid the foundation for who I am today."
Great. Okay. So let's shoot forward again. So you climb the corporate ladder, you do really successfully, and then life goes in a different direction. You hit the bottom. And rather than start drinking or drugging and going off down that hole, you decide you're going to get out of it. I get some sense of why you did that because you have these skills and experiences. You have the love of your mother and the experiences with your grandmother and your father, and thinking, I don't want to be like that. There's a better way. And you develop critical thinking. I get that. And you start to use your brain and realize you've got it. Um, at what point did you think, well, this is the issues for me are around being a man, being a father, and I want to do something about that. I want to put that into practice. At what point did you feel that calling, I guess, in your life?
Well, first of all, here's the miracle that I experienced.
Yeah,
I was sitting up, this again, after my divorce and everything. I
yeah,
was sitting up late one night because I was too depressed to sleep.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I remember seeing a commercial about depression.
Okay.
And as I watched the commercial, I recognized that I had all of those symptoms. I didn't even realize I was depressed. Even though I had gone through all that loss, all that pain, I didn't realize that I was depressed. Well, as I watched this commercial, I went, oh, that's me.
Hmm.
I'm depressed. And so I did what I always do. I started researching depression. So I started reading all these books. And in one of the books, this guy says the only way to heal was to create what he called an interpersonal bridge with another human being.
Yeah. Yes,
And
spot on.
as I read that, I went, oh, I don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
And because of that statement, I said, I got to figure out how to create that bridge. And so for me, in my little mind, I thought, okay, a therapist can probably help me create that bridge.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I gained the courage to go to therapy as a result of reading that one sentence.
Yeah.
And that's how my transformational journey began. I gained the courage to go to therapy. My therapist started helping me understand how that the traumatic childhood that I experienced had impacted my life and that I was still carrying a lot of that pain. Oh, I have to share this story.
Do.
So I go to therapy, and the most difficult part about going to therapy, first of all, for me was how do you find a therapist? How do you
So
find a
many
therapist?
people out there calling themselves this, right?
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah. So here's how I found my therapist.
Yeah.
I got a phone book. I put a phone book on my table. I did like this, and I just I chose a therapist by chance, if you will,
Yeah.
and I found the absolute perfect therapist. So I go to therapy, and here's where my life literally changed. I'm sitting in front of the therapist, and she asked me to share some of the things I remembered from my childhood.
Mm.
And so I started sharing about my grandmother and
Mm.
all the abuse and trauma. And as I'm sharing these things with her, I've got this big smile on my face.
Mm.
And she says, Michael, why are you smiling? Those were those things were terrible. That's you shouldn't be smiling. Those were painful things. And my response was, I'm okay.
Mm.
I'm great. She says, Michael, you're not okay. You're not great. I said, but I made it. I made it.
Mm.
I'm talking about my success, right? And then she said this, Michael, how would you feel if those same things happened to your son?
Yeah, exactly. Great question. Great question.
And when she did, it's like I got out of my head and I allowed myself to feel years and years of suppressed and repressed pain.
Yeah.
And for about 15 seconds, I allowed myself to feel that pain, and tears are flowing. The pain is intense. And all of a sudden, I got out of my heart and went to my head and said, wait, what did you do? How did you do that? Right. And so I got mad. I got mad at the therapist. What did you just do to me? She says, Mike, I didn't do anything. And here's what she said, Michael, you have years and years of suppressed and repressed pain.
Mm.
And the only way out is through.
Mm.
I can guide you through, but you have to be willing to do the work to heal.
Mm.
And I went, okay, I'm committed. And it
Great.
was from that point on, that's where my life changed. That's where my
It's
life changed.
amazing because I think it's right. A lot of men don't realize that they're ill. They don't realize they're depressed or anxious or traumatized. They just think it's life. It's just
Yeah.
me. This is who I am. It's not, guys. And actually, I hear it so many times when somebody manages to explain something properly to guys, they get it and they go. And like you, just go, hang on, this ain't right. You're right. You need to deal with something.
But I think for me, I think there's only two things that will cause a person to want to change.
Yeah.
Okay. One is pain, and the other is what I call divine discontent,
Yeah.
which is just an inner feeling and inner knowing that something's just off.
Yeah.
Well, for me, I was in so much pain. I didn't have a choice.
Yeah.
It was either get help or die.
Okay.
That was for me.
So you start your own personal journey, you start your work, and you start learning about the importance of relationships, the interpersonal bridge, and you start to learn the importance of embodying your experience and feeling it, so that you're not just up here, getting more and more defenses against feelings. Because the problem about feelings is you either have them or you don't have them, right? And if you avoid all the painful feelings, you also avoid all the good feelings and the good feelings that give us meaning and purpose in life, with our relationships. So that we can't really feel love if we're numbed out. Ultimately, numbing out leads to drugs and alcohol, etc. That's where it goes ultimately, and that's where a lot of goes. And for a lot of guys, it ultimately goes to things like violence as well to avoid dealing with this. And to avoid feeling like a victim and all of that sort of stuff. So you choose to go the other way, you dive into it, you work through it, and it allows you to get in touch with what you understand to be your purpose and meaning as a human, right? So tell me about where along that process did you then decide, well, I need to get this out to other guys? Because it's sort of good enough just to get it for yourself, isn't it? It's like, okay, I'm
Yeah,
out of
but
this, I'm fine. Why then go, well, I need to share it with other guys? I mean,
but a couple of things I have to share though.
go on, go on.
So after approximately 6 sessions with my therapist, approximately 6 sessions, I'll never forget.
Yeah.
My therapist says, Michael, you've done some amazing work. You've had some major breakthroughs. And actually, there's not a lot I can do for you individually. So what I've done is I've put together this group that I'd like you to join
Oh,
to,
brilliant.
to
Yeah,
continue your healing journey, right? Well, I wasn't feeling that at all. I said, and these were my exact words.
yeah.
I'm fixed.
Oh,
I
yeah.
said, I'm fixed. I don't think I need any more therapy. And I walk away from therapy. Now, the good news is I was obsessed with my healing. I was committed to my healing. I just wasn't comfortable enough being that vulnerable in a group of people. It was difficult enough with just one person. So I just walked away. But here's the good news. And this is this is why I see everything through a spiritual lens, because here's a miracle that happened. So I walk away from therapy, but I'm still committed to my growth. And I'm on a plane and I sit next to this lady. And I have no idea how we got on the subject, but somehow we started talking about childhood trauma.
Okay.
And she asked me if I'd ever heard of a guy named John Bradshaw.
Mhm.
Do you know John Bradshaw?
Not really. Tell me about it.
He's a therapist. Actually, he passed away a couple of years ago, but he's a therapist that here in Houston, well, actually internationally, he had a television show dealing with childhood trauma and just a really famous guy. But anyway, so she asked me if I heard of this guy. I said, no. She says, look, you might want to check him out because he's a leading authority on childhood trauma. Well, when I get home, I find this book that he wrote called Healing the Shame That Binds You. And in that book, I identified and recognized that what had been driving my behavior for most of my life was what he called toxic shame.
Yes. Yes.
That toxic shame, which had driven all of my success, right? Well, it turned out that John Bradshaw offered this 3-day workshop called Healing Your Inner Child.
Mhm.
I go to this 3-day workshop and I really allow myself to surrender and heal all of that packed up trauma that I had started dealing with in therapy.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until I did this 3-day workshop that I really allowed myself to feel and heal and let go of all of that trauma from that being with my crazy grandmother
Mhm.
and the abuse that I experienced. So it was that experience that allowed me to heal my heart, get truly connected with who I am as a human being. And so, again, I started feeling really good because I learned how to identify my emotions. And I said, there's got to be other guys out there that's dealing with this same stuff,
Yeah.
especially Black guys,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Yes.
And so in 1995, I wrote a book called Brothers Are You Listening? A Success Guide for the 90s.
Yeah.
And in the book, I share my experience of going to therapy. I share my experience of dealing with racism. I share my experience of finding my purpose. And so it was really my attempt to empower other men.
Yeah.
And so back in 1995, when I wrote that book, I really took a deep dive into manhood and masculinity.
Yeah.
And I've been speaking and writing about those issues since then. And again, I've written a total of 15 books, most of them primarily targeted to men.
Yeah. 15. I'm sorry, I'm a bit silenced by that because I think people are insane just deciding to write one. You've written 15. How have you managed that, for God's sake?
I love writing, and I
You
know that
obviously do. You obviously,
writing, writing is a gift.
yeah,
Um, I really believe that. And so I mentioned earlier that as a human being, I think we all show up with a divine purpose.
yeah,
And I believe we all have these unique gifts and talents in us. And
yeah.
it is our responsibility to figure out what they are. And I was just fortunate to find my purpose, which is writing and speaking and empowering others.
So going back to the 90s, and I remember way back then because I'm like you, similar generation, 60s born and brought up. Similar life story in some ways, but the British Irish version of it. So growing up in, broken homes and immigrant populations and government housing and all that sort of stuff. So lots of resonances there for me. Um, now, sort of now, I think there's a thirst for understanding male experience and positive, healthy male experience. And back in the 90s, there wasn't really. I remember when I first started doing work with fathers. When was it? I qualified 30 years ago, so it was about 35 years ago. I was doing set up a project to help fathers and noticed that when I was trying to work with guys and get them involved in fathering projects, that you'd go to a parent and toddler group, but it actually was a mother and toddler group. And it was structured so that as a man, it was very difficult to go along to. It was an uncomfortable experience. These days, I think it's got better, but you must have had similar types of experiences around then, and the suspicions about being a guy, particularly with the, as you say, this label of toxic masculinity. Well, it's toxic behavior that gets attached inappropriately to masculinity. It's real. These behaviors are real. Nobody's denying them. Um, but but what's that been like for you in terms of during that period of time? That's quite a long time to be in that field.
Well, but once again, here are some reasons for my optimism.
Okay.
When I started this process, again, and I started this healing, I remember going to a bookstore and I was trying to find books for men
Yeah.
about dealing with divorce and all this. There were very few books out
I'm
there.
just going to stop you there because there's a brilliant this guy, Australian psychotherapist, he wrote a book called Raising Boys. I can't remember his name, it'll come to me. But he has a great line, which I think will resonate with you. He said, when you want to find psychologically informed literature about women, there's like a whole trainload of it. If you want to find it about guys, you might find enough to fit in the glove box of a car.
Yeah.
There's almost nothing else there. It's just not a subject that's talked about, really.
Well, back then, especially, there
Yeah.
were very few books for men. And specifically for Black men,
Yeah.
I was like, wait a minute, I can't be the only guy that's dealing with this stuff, right? And so there was a book called Iron John
Yeah. I remember Ryan John. Yeah. Yeah.
by Robert Bly back in the 80s. And there was a book called Fire in the Belly by a guy named Sam Keen,
Okay.
which was kind of the start of the men's movement, right? And so I was following these guys and reading their works and said, well, I have a voice. Let me put my voice out there. And so the good news is I believe there's been a major shift collectively, globally, that men are beginning to wake up.
Yeah, I agree totally, actually.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I believe because if you'll notice that we're starting to remove the stigma of therapy. We had in June Mental Health Month,
Yeah.
right? And more men are getting comfortable talking about, the traumas and how therapy has helped them. And so I'm really optimistic about the future because collectively, I think as a species, I mentioned earlier that I believe the greatest challenge we have on the planet is to redefine manhood and masculinity.
I
And I
agree.
I
I agree.
believe I
Yeah.
believe that's happening.
Yeah.
Because I think again, men are hungry for this. I think men are tired and frustrated with the old ways of being men.
I think in particular, and I often say this when I'm talking to people, that the young men I meet today blow my mind. They absolutely blow my mind. Young men today, I think, are so switched on in comparison to the way I was. Because I grew up in the 70s, as it were, when all this stuff was changing, when the sort of stereotypes were being questioned quite appropriately and changing. I remember having conversations with my dad when I was making some food once, and him saying to me, "Why are you making food?" I'm like, "Because I'm hungry." And he's saying, "Well, no, that's what women do." Just like,
Mm,
you know what I mean?
yeah,
I
yeah.
remember that stuff, right? And like, no, I'm hungry. I'm going to make food. Get out of my face. Um, and now we've moved on significantly, and sort of a lot of young men I meet now are really interesting in the way they talk about themselves, the way they think about themselves, how they think about their own construction of masculinity, and how free they feel and seem to be. Not all young men, but a lot more than used to be about sort of deciding what they want to be and how they want to be rather than allowing these roles to be ascribed to them. You're nodding away. Is that a similar experience for you now?
Yeah, and so I mentioned earlier that I think we need to create a new paradigm of masculinity.
Okay.
So here's how I define a paradigm.
Yeah.
A paradigm is simply a rigid way of believing, thinking, and behaving.
Yeah.
That's how I define a paradigm. So as men, we have to change what we believe, how we think, and how we act.
Yeah.
And so as men, if we look at the evolution, if you will, that men are now, for example, in America for the first time, we actually have more women in the workforce than men
Mm.
for the first time. We also have more women graduating from college than men.
Mm.
So the roles of masculinity are changing dramatically because of the changing roles of women. Okay. We're on the possible verge of having a female president. Who would have thought
Yeah.
that?
Amazing.
Right.
Amazing. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So again, I think the question is how many men are going to be courageous enough to embrace this new paradigm, this new way of believing, thinking, and behaving, and what it means to be a man.
Yeah.
Again, my optimism says men are ready. Men are hungry because again, when I started this back in the 90s, there were very few men. Now there's literally thousands of coaches and books and podcasts
Yeah.
dealing with men and men having this conversation. So there's a woman that I admire. Her name is Barbara Marx Hubbard.
Okay.
And she passed away a couple of years ago, but she wrote an amazing book called Conscious Evolution.
Mhm.
And in her book, she theorizes that human beings are still evolving. And I firmly believe that. I believe human beings are still evolving, but we're evolving in consciousness.
Yeah.
Okay. We're
Yeah.
evolving
Yeah. Yeah.
in our awareness. And so, again, that's the reason for my optimism because as human beings, we're still growing.
Yeah. And also, I mean, I would say, coming from a psychological perspective, a lot of the stuff that we do socially is very much constructed. It's not predetermined by biology at all. Biology facilitates communication and connection. That's what it does. What we do with it is our choice, as far as I.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
there are, as you've indicated, sort of bigger, wider political issues going on and possible structural changes. And it's very interesting to watch from this side of the pond the potential for a female president alongside a guy who seems to be genuinely kind and open and loving and a great dad, right? And really seems to me to be a very positive role model of an older guy he is who he is, right? And I like that, but it definitely in contrast to some of the male figures in the other party who seem to be quite regressive and backwards from my perspective. And again, I'm not taking political sides, but I'm
Right.
evaluating it psychologically. I find those men deeply unattractive as a man myself. The sort of guys who I would walk around if I saw them, talking in a bar, I'd go in the opposite direction because I'd be afraid of them. And
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Whereas
sure.
Tim Waltz, Mr. Waltz, if he was talking somewhere, I might find him a bit boring and old-fashioned, but I would warm to him, right? Do you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
but see, but here's another way to look at it also. If we have a female president,
Yeah.
her husband becomes the first husband, right?
Yes, and that's amazing. Wow.
Yeah, and for men, that's emasculating for the woman to be the more powerful one,
For
right?
some men, it might be.
Yeah, for most men in America,
Yeah.
right, would be emasculated. For example, I remember when I first started dating my wife. My wife was the first woman that I dated that made more money than I did.
Wow.
And at the beginning, it really bugged me.
Did it?
It did. But I've learned to accept it. It's like, it's not a problem. But again, I think collectively as men, we have to get past this idea
Yeah.
because I think, as men, we were taught that we had three primary
Yeah.
responsibilities, right? The three P's: procreate, provide, and protect.
Yeah.
Right. So as men, that's what we try to do.
Yeah.
But see, as the roles continue to change, then it's really not about providing and protecting. It's really about learning to connect.
Yeah.
As men, what we want is connection. What we long for is connection.
Yes.
And in order to have connection, you got to have emotions. You got to be
Yeah.
connected to your heart. And I
That's
think that's what men are longing for.
I agree. And also I think when with that emotional connection, the connection to authentic self and others, that's where we grow, essentially. And that's where we stop this toxic behavior because it becomes impossible. This is the other side. There's toxic shame and there's healthy shame, right? And the healthy shame is I can't hurt you because I'd be ashamed of hurting you because you're important to me, because I love you and I love myself. And that's what healthy shame is. And that's what genuinely puts boundaries around us in terms of our behavior, not a fear of retribution, but a fear that we'll judge ourselves in a way that is really painful. And we should if we're going around hurting people, to be honest.
Yeah.
You've just written another book, I believe. Is that correct? Tell
Yes,
me
it's
about it.
called Stop Blaming Men for All
That's
the
really
Problems.
the title grabbed me because initially I looked at it and I went, "Is this guy just going to be a whining victim?"
And the subtitle is How Men's Work is Changing the World for the Better.
Great. Ah, great. So tell me
So
what inspired this book and the title.
well, once again, my primary focus has been on the changing roles of manhood and masculinity.
Yeah,
And this book is really an attempt to just challenge men to really look at and examine what it means to be a man.
yeah,
And again, it's not coming at it from a victim perspective. It's really coming at it from a heart-opening perspective. In one of the chapters, I talk a lot about vulnerability.
yeah.
Talk about the
The
importance as
dreaded V
men.
word.
Yes, for men, right? But it's really a conversation that men can have with themselves about
Right.
how they view themselves as men.
Yeah,
So for men who are really tired and frustrated with all the negative attacks that we as men get on a daily basis, and for the men who are courageous enough to begin that inner journey to self, it's a really good guidebook that can help you identify, some aspects of yourself that maybe you aren't aware of, but more importantly, to just be connected to another man that's really open, honest, and vulnerable.
right. Is that book available on Amazon or?
Yes, it's available any online bookstore.
Great. So I'd recommend guys to go and read it. And if your guy won't read it, maybe wifey, you read it for him, and then feed a few of the ideas into his brain when he's not looking at you too closely. That's usually how it happens in my experience. Have you got a
Absolutely.
website, Michael? Because we're sort of coming to the end of the hour. I told you to fly by.
Yeah,
Website.
as we wind down, if you'll go to coachmichaeltaylor.com, you can gain access, again, 15 different books, most of them dealing with masculinity and manhood. But I also write about spirituality. I write about entrepreneurship.
Right.
Uh, and it's really, again, I like to think of myself as just an ordinary guy who made a commitment to live an extraordinary life.
Yeah.
And again, I believe, despite what we see in mainstream media, I believe there's never been a better time to be alive on the planet than right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's my belief. And
Absolutely.
so I think men have to change their perception. And the way to do that is to stop looking at the media, stop looking out there, and to go in here, look in here.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's what my work is about.
I agree. And to stop living in a world that's threatening, start to live in a world that's benign, loving, compassionate, connected, and then life just does get better, you know.
Absolutely.
It really
It
does, without a doubt. Um, it's also very inspiring talking to you as somebody in the US right now, because the US has been going through some turbulent times for a while now, and it's lovely to talk to a kind, loving man like you, who isn't bitter but is sort of very positive about the future. And I totally agree with you. We can shape the future by what we do and how we think and how we feel. And I do think the future is going to be better, but I've always felt that way about it.
Yeah, and there's really two ways to look at life.
Yeah,
We can look at life is primarily a dangerous place
yeah.
with only moments of safety,
Don't do that.
or we can see life as primarily a safe place
Yeah,
with only moments of danger.
yeah,
And
yeah.
so it's a choice. So I choose to see life as primarily a safe place.
I'm with
Uh,
you.
once again, I am an optimist. That's the lens through which I see the world.
Yeah.
And I believe this is an awesome time to be alive.
I'm with you, and I think as a psychological strategy, it makes a lot more sense. Because I think when we're pro-social in that way, people are naturally gravitate towards us, and people, that's our solution. More connections, the better.
Yeah,
No,
absolutely.
really
Absolutely.
is. Listen, Michael, it's been an absolute joy to have you with me today. I'm really excited that you're on the planet and you're doing what you're doing. I'd encourage people to go and check out your website. Tell us your website name again.
CoachMichaelTaylor.com.
So go and check out Coach Michael's website and his books. You stay there when I say goodbye to folks. Folks, I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. It's a real inspiration to me, and it's a nice walk down memory lane going back decades when old men like us were young and we were fighting this fight a long time ago. It's
But no, if I could again, and you're another reason for my optimism. The
right.
fact that you're having this conversation, the fact that we're having this conversation about manhood and masculinity, again, fills me with optimism because the more conversations we have like this, the more we can change the world.
Absolutely. I want to see a day when there's as many versions of manhood as there are men on the planet, and we're all having a nice jabber about it, our own unique manhoodness. So that'd be
Absolutely.
a lovely day. Stay there. Bye bye, folks. I'll see you at the next show. I hope you've enjoyed this and hope you have a great evening. Bye bye for now.